Hello, my name is Dr. Jonathan Bentovish, and I'm recording an important video presentation following the publication of God's Physics New Scientific Paradigm for the 21st Century. This book has been published by iUniverse.com, and there's been over 70 peer-reviewed articles that have been published so far, including 2 special issues, now a 3rd special issue coming out about this new scientific paradigm. The God's physics paradigm has been called previously the Computational Unified Field Theory, named after Einstein's famous quest for a unifying field theory. And the topic of today's presentation is a call for the leading universities and experimental physicists around the world to further validate, I should say, the critical predictions of this new scientific paradigm. I'll give at the beginning of this important talk my personal email, which is drbentwich, drbentwich @gmail.com, my personal email, so that the leading universities and experimental physicists around the world can communicate with me directly about this very important topic. I would say at the beginning of this talk that we stand at a historic turning point, equivalent, I would say, to the turning point of last century's scientific revolution of Einstein in 1905 and then 1915 and particularly 1919, with the validation, empirical validation of at least one critical prediction of Einstein's general relativity theory. As we all know, Eddington, the famous British astronomer, validated one of Einstein's critical predictions of general relativity theory, that was regarding Mercury's double-valued perihelion pathway around the sun, which was 1.6 arc according to Einstein's general relativity theory, as opposed to 0.8 according to Newtonian mechanics. And once that critical prediction has been validated by Eddington in 1919 solar eclipse, at that point, science and scientists had to accept the new paradigm for 20th century physics. And in a sense, we stand now at a precisely equivalent point to that turning point of 20th century physics. We stand now at the turning point of 21st century physics, with the initial empirical validations, 2 initial empirical validations of this new computational field theories, or God's physics new paradigm. Before doing that, I would just mention again the fact that we know, according to Thomas Kuhn's accepted and very well-known analysis of the structure of scientific revolutions, that was an influential book he wrote in 1962, but it's been accepted across the board, in a sense, on how science evolves. And what Thomas Kuhn is telling us, and what Einstein has proven with his 1919 solar eclipse validation by Eddington, is that science alternates between phases of standard science, as Thomas Kuhn termed that, phases in which a given scientific paradigm, such as Newtonian classical mechanics, such as Einstein's general relativity theory and quantum mechanics, are accepted by the scientific community because they're quite successful in explaining the known experimental data, and they're the simplest, most elegant way of explaining the knowledge or the data that we have at a given time. But what Thomas Kuhn is teaching us is that there reaches points along the development of science where the standard paradigm, let's say Newtonian mechanics, was good for a while, for the 18th, 19th century. It was good for a while, and it explained the universe, and scientists could work within that framework. But there comes a point along the development of science in which that framework, that standard science paradigm, simply fails to explain certain phenomena, new phenomena, key phenomena, and also there appears theoretical inconsistencies within the standard paradigm, then it's regarded as the old paradigm, and then there has to be a shift, a paradigmatic shift towards a new paradigm which is broader, which can explain those phenomena that cannot be explained by the old standard paradigm, and which can resolve the apparent inconsistencies, theoretical inconsistencies that appear within the old standard paradigm. And specifically when that new paradigm, new scientific paradigm, is able to come up with at least one critical prediction that is unique to the new paradigm, and that is validated experimentally as more valid than the predictions of the old standard paradigm, that's the point at which science embraces the new paradigm. And in a sense, I give a metaphor of the expansion of our knowledge. If a person was, just as a metaphor, if a person was born in a room, confined room, and all they know of the universe is that room, that works for a while, but then when there is knocks on the door, or a beam going through, iron beam going through the wall, or knocks on the wall, then that person starts suspecting that that room is confined, that there's something outside that room. And when that person opens the door and discovers that that room is perfectly fine, but that room exists within the house, and then the house exists within the neighborhood, etc., etc. That's the expansion of knowledge, scientific knowledge, that is taking place through, it's a metaphor explaining how Thomas Kuhn is telling us that science is expanding its gaze, or its understanding, theoretical understanding of the universe, from a room to a house to a neighborhood. It's expanding its knowledge. That means, by the way, I like to quote Einstein's famous quote when he was asked whether his general relativity theory would remain valid in 100 years from 1919. And Einstein, being very humble, said that no, he doesn't believe that his general theory of relativity, even though it's considered to be the greatest intellectual achievement by one individual scientist, he still recognized the fact that his theory, he said, it would not hold true forever in 100 years. He said, I just hope that general relativity theory will become a special case within a broader theoretical understanding. And that's essentially what's happening always with the paradigmatic shift or shifts from the old standard paradigm to a new paradigm, when that old paradigm, or that old standard scientific paradigm, fails to account for these unexplained phenomena, key phenomena, and when there arises theoretical inconsistencies which are key amongst the old paradigm. And what I'm essentially saying is that today, the same way that when Einstein came up with his general theory of relativity, that was at a crisis, at a paradigmatic crisis, which took place in the older standard scientific paradigm of Newtonian mechanics. There was a basic contradiction between Newtonian mechanics and Maxwellian electromagnetic theory. There was a major key phenomena of the ether concept, which was a purely hypothetical concept that was assumed to that fine element ether concept. The ether element was hypothetical, and it was assumed to perfuse the whole universe. And yet various experiments were performed, including the Michelson-Morley experiment, famous experiment, and they failed to detect or to verify the existence of that ether concept. When that was the case, then Einstein said, okay, there is a paradigmatic crisis, and we have to expand our understanding to the new paradigm. In the case of 20th century physics, that was general relativity theory, which again was verified through a specific critical prediction, unique critical prediction about Mercury's double-valued perihelion around the sun. When that was validated by Eddington, then the scientific community had to accept and embraced gradually relativity theory, general relativity theory, as the new valid paradigm for 20th century physics, which again significantly embedded within it Newtonian mechanics as a special case. And we stand at exactly the same point. I want to highlight the fact that we are passing we're moving on from the paradigmatic crisis that exists between the contradiction that exists between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. General relativity theory assumes that there is a cause and effect, clear cause and effect relationship mediated by the speed of light barrier. In other words, if there is an event happening in a certain point in space-time, there is a time limit or a speed of light barrier that would constrain an observer situated in a different place knowledge of that event. Just to make it clear, if the sun, God forbid, was extinguished at this moment, it would still take 8 minutes for the light beam to travel from the sun to our planet Earth until we would know that the sun was extinguished. So that's a clear cause and effect relationship that is constrained by the speed of light. In quantum mechanics, we know about the quantum entanglement phenomena verified by Bell's experiment, which indicates or seems to indicate that there is quantum entanglement, two entangled particles which are separated then by a certain distance. A measurement of one of these entangled particles would cause an instantaneous effect on the other entangled particles' complementary physical properties. And that seems to contradict general relativity theory's constraint of the light speed barrier, speed of light barrier. So that's one key contradiction or apparent contradiction between general relativity theory and quantum mechanics. The other one, which is becoming a growing problem in 21st century physics standard paradigm or old standard paradigm of both relativity theory and quantum mechanics. I'll explain in a second that they do share a certain basic assumption. So both of them actually comprise what I call the old material causal paradigm or standard paradigm. And that paradigm, another experimental phenomena, empirical phenomena that cannot be explained by the old material causal paradigm of both relativity theory and quantum mechanics, is the accelerated expansion of the universe. I'm saying that because the only way that old paradigm, old standard material causal paradigm is able to try and explain the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion is by assuming that there exists purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts, which is, by the way, equivalent to Einstein's time ether concept. At that time, the ether concept could not be verified, and that's when Einstein decided to discard the ether concept as superfluous, as non-existent. And we're standing at the same equivalent point, because the phenomena of the accelerated expansion of the universe can only be explained by these purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts. And lo and behold, now for 20 years, 2 full decades, scientists, experimental physicists, astronomers, etc., have been trying to detect or verify the existence of this purely hypothetical dark matter, dark energy concepts, which are, by the way, assumed to comprise up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe. So the great majority of all the mass and energy in the universe are assumed, hypothesized to comprise these dark matter, dark energy concepts. But yet for 20 years, 2 full decades, scientists have not been able to verify the existence of this dark matter, dark energy, purely hypothetical concepts. So that's a major problem for the old material causal paradigm. And at that point, according to Thomas Kuhn's analysis, and again, this is exactly what happened with Einstein 100 years ago, at that point, science starts sensing that there has to be a paradigmatic shift from the old standard paradigm, in this case of general relativity theory and quantum mechanics, which I entitle the old material causal paradigm, to a new paradigm which could explain, resolve the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and general relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and could also explain, offer an alternative satisfactory explanation for the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion. Just as a side note, to highlight the fact fact that science and scientists are starting to sense that the inability of experimental physicists to detect dark matter, dark energy now for the past 20 years comprises a major problem for science. There's an article that came out in Scientific American just a few months ago, whose title was The Last Stand of Dark Matter and Dark Energy. And essentially, even though there is still attempts to find that dark matter, dark energy, but the title itself and the article denotes that for science, for 21st century science, it is a major problem, the fact that dark matter, dark energy cannot be detected. So the title was The Last Stand of Dark Matter, Dark Energy, implying that unless scientists can really detect and verify directly the existence of dark matter, dark energy, they would have to be discarded. I actually went forward like Einstein and discarded dark matter, dark energy as superfluous, the same way that Einstein discarded the ether concept after many years that it was there were attempts to validate its existence, but they failed. And so what I'm saying is that physics is 21st century physics is entering a phase of a paradigmatic shift. There is a paradigmatic crisis of the old material causal paradigm. In a word, the reason that I call this old paradigm as material causal is because both relativity theory and quantum mechanics assume a basic material causal assumption. Excuse me. And that assumption, that material causal assumption, is essentially telling us that both general relativity theory and quantum mechanics are assuming that everything in the universe operates by cause and effect, by material interactions of cause and effect. As an example, the general relativity theory is telling us that the universe was created by an initial Big Bang nuclear event. There was a cause and effect. That nuclear Big Bang event, which caused the creation of space-time, energy and mass, galaxies, stars, etc. Quantum mechanics has the same material causal assumption in a different way, but it's also assuming that every subatomic measurement or our knowledge of every subatomic target's properties are constrained and are essentially mediated by a cause and effect material interaction. So we have the probability wave function assumed to comprise the target element, and that undergoes a collapse when a probe subatomic particle is interacting with this target's subatomic probability wave function. That causes that interaction between the probe and target elements causes the collapse of this probability wave function of the target into a single complementary space, energy, time, mass value of the target element. Again, in both cases, general relativity theory and quantum mechanics assume that the universe can be explained whether at the macroscopic relativistic level or at the microscopic quantum level, just as a result of cause and effect interactions between material entities. That's the old material causal paradigm. So we understand that we're at the midst of a paradigmatic crisis of the old material causal paradigm, signified by, again, the inability of the old paradigm both to resolve the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and moreover, the existence of this key phenomenon of the accelerated expansion of the universe, where the old material causal paradigm, the only way that it can explain that is by assuming the existence of dark matter, dark energy, comprising up to 95% of all the mass and energy in the universe, but that cannot be detected. So that's a major problem. So we are at the midst of a paradigmatic crisis of the old standard paradigm, the material causal paradigm, and actually the paradigmatic shift, the necessary paradigmatic shift towards a new paradigm, which can resolve these apparent theoretical inconsistencies, which can offer an alternative satisfactory explanation for the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, and which is most importantly or significantly now supported by unique critical predictions of the new God's physics or computational unified field theory, two critical predictions, unique critical predictions of this new God's physics paradigm, excuse me, that have been validated empirically. And again, I'm calling the leading universities and experimental physicists to further assist me in further validating this new paradigm of 21st century theoretical physics. So now is the time perhaps to mention, before I mention the two critical predictions that have received initial empirical validations, I'll just highlight some of the relevant key theoretical postulates of this new God's physics or computational unified field theory paradigm. So the most important discovery or theoretical postulate of this new God's physics paradigm is called the Universal Computational Principle or Universal Consciousness Principle, UCP acronym. And essentially it says that the way to explain and resolve the theoretical inconsistency between general relativity theory and quantum mechanics, the way to advance science, remember opening the room into a house or the house into a neighborhood, the way to expand our understanding of the physical universe is by postulating and discovering the existence of a singular higher ordered universal computational / consciousness principle. That universal computational / consciousness principle, or acronym UCP, computes simultaneously all the spatial pixels comprising the entire universe, physical universe, at every minimal time point. Essentially, it's assuming that the UCP computes a series, extremely rapid series of universal frames. So at each minimal time point, the UCP computes simultaneously the whole universe as one universal frame. I give the metaphor of the cinematic film metaphor, in which even though we may be looking at a movie or at a film in which we see a jet plane zooming through the screen, and it seems very real and it seems that the plane has a velocity, really when we stop the film we would see that the plane does not have velocity, but rather the plane image is presented at one point in the first frame and then displaced into a different point in the second frame, etc., etc. That gives us the impression or the perception that there is a continuous reality, but really it's comprised of discrete, non-continuous frames. And that's a metaphor for what's happening with this God's physics new paradigm, and essentially saying the UCP is creating this series, extremely rapid series of universal frames, not film frames, but universal frames of the whole universe. It's assumed the new God's physics paradigm assumes or postulates that this UCP computes this series of frames at the incredible rate of c squared divided by Planck's constant, which gives us 1.36 in the power of minus 50. So many trillions of times per second, this UCP is creating a frame, a universal frame, dissolving it back into the UCP, and then creating a larger frame, etc., etc. So it's creation of a frame, simultaneous computing of the UCP of all the spatial pixels of the frame. The frame is created simultaneously. Then it's being dissolved at the rate of c squared divided by Planck's constant, so 1.36 in the power of minus 50. Many trillions of times per second, the UCP is creating a frame, dissolving it, creating another frame, etc. And each frame is, by the way, a little bit larger than the previous frame. That's connected to the alternative explanation of God's physics new paradigm about the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, which I'll get into. So that first postulate of God's physics or computational unified field theory paradigm is that there exists a singular higher ordered UCP that simultaneously computes all the spatial pixels in the universe. It's creating a series, extremely rapid series of universal frames at that rate of many trillions of times per second. And that's the first key postulate of this God's physics new paradigm. What that entails, by the way, is that I call this new paradigm the new acausal computation paradigm, God's physics or computational Unified Field Theory is a causal computation paradigm. And the reason I call it, or it was called the a-causal computation paradigm, is because once we realize that the UCP simultaneously computes all the spatial pixels in the universe, that also implies that there cannot be any cause and effect within any given universal frame, and there cannot be any cause and effect between any two consecutive, or generally any consecutive universal frames. Because during one frame, a single frame, the UCP computes all the spatial pixels simultaneously, so that negates the possibility of the existence of any cause and effect material interaction between the spatial pixels of a single frame. And then because all the spatial pixels of the universe dissolve between one frame and another back into the UCP, there cannot be any causal material interaction or any physical effect, any material interaction between one frame and the subsequent frame. It implies that what seems to us as cause and effect relationships are much more the result of the UCP arranging the series of frames in a certain order and certain pattern that gives us the impression that there is cause and effect. But truly, there's no cause and effect in the material causal sense. There is the arrangement, the computation of a series of universal frames and certain characteristics of this UCP in the manner in which it arranges those frames, or in the manner that its characteristics, which are then implying certain evolution of those frames. It's a very different way of looking at the universe, and it has profound theoretical implications. I would mention another few postulates. So alongside this new understanding of God's physics, or computational unified field theory, that the UCP is actually creating this series of frames and computing for each spatial pixel its four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time. With this comes new computational definitions, which have been spelled out in those 70 to 80 articles and in the book. But there comes new, God's physics postulates new computational definitions of space, energy, mass, and time. And those are embedded, or those are ensuing from another key theoretical postulates, which is that the UCP possesses three computational dimensions. Two of them are very relevant to these four basic physical features, and those are the computational dimensions of framework and consistency. The UCP possesses three computational dimensions: framework, consistency, and locus. I'm going to leave aside locus for a second. That has to do much more with relativistic aspects. But the basic idea is that framework and consistency, two computational dimensions of the UCP, each of them possesses two levels, computational levels. So the framework comprises frame level, computational level, or object, meaning the UCP can compute changes across the frames, the universal frames, either relating to the whole entire frame. So the frame level would be when the UCP computes the changes, let's say, of an object relative to the entire frame, the coordinate system of the entire frame. That would be the frame computational level. And object would be when the UCP computes the changes or lack of changes within a given object relative to itself. So we're looking at computing and looking at the changes of a given object across the frames. So the framework has frame. UCP is computing the changes or lack of changes of an object relative to the entire frame across a series of frames. Or object, when the UCP computes the changes or lack of changes occurring relative to the same object or within the same object, the constitution of that object across a series of frames. And I've already implied that the second computational dimension of consistency has consistent or inconsistent computational levels. So when we put these two things together, these two computational dimensions together, which is what the UCP is doing, is computing for every spatial pixel the four basic computational combinations of framework, which comprises frame and object, and consistency, which comprises consistent and inconsistent. Simply stated, that would mean that when the UCP needs to compute or sets to compute the object, the frame consistent or inconsistent computational combinations, the frame consistent computational measure would be space. The space inconsistent computational combination would be energy. Same thing for object. Object consistent computational measure would be mass. Object inconsistent computational combination would be time. So we see that the UCP, according to this new God's physics paradigm, is computing simultaneously for each spatial pixel comprising the entire universe the four basic physical features of space energy as frame consistent or inconsistent computation, and object, so frame consistent and inconsistent would be space and energy. Object consistent and inconsistent computational computations would be consistent mass, inconsistent time. So the four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time are computed through the UCP as a frame consistent or inconsistent, object consistent or inconsistent computations, simultaneous computations for each spatial pixel in the universe. So the second postulate would be that UCP's three, relevant to our discussion, two computational dimensions of space, of framework and consistency, which gives rise to the computation of the four basic physical features of space, energy, time, mass, and time. And then another theoretical postulate associated with this whole discovery is what I call the universal computational formula. That's actually a formula that describes the manner in which this UCP is computing simultaneously all the spatial pixels in the universe at this incredible rate of c squared divided by Planck's constant. It's depicted, by the way, at the bottom of the God's Physics book, and it's described and delineated in all those 70 to 80 articles. Essentially, that universal computational formula is the first time in physics, in theoretical physics, that this universal computational formula is able to unify completely between these four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time. Einstein, as we all know, in general relativity theory, was able to unify between space, time. Space-time became a four-dimensional continuum. Energy and mass, that's the energy-mass equivalence of E equals mc squared, and the curvature of space-time by massive objects. But that was not yet a complete integration or complete unification of those four basic physical features, which is what this new God's physics universal computational formula, it does accomplish that. It does unify the four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time in one formula. It integrates and resolves the apparent inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. In fact, two formats or representations of this universal computational formula, one of them is the relativistic format, the other one is the quantum format, which indicate that certain key relationships of relativity theory and quantum mechanics are appearing as special cases or as embedded within this relativistic format and quantum format. But essentially, this universal computational formula is integrating quantum mechanics and relativity theory as different components of that much broader new theoretical understanding of the universe. And it's the first time, as I said, that the God's physics or computational unified field theory is able to completely unify between space, energy, mass, and time as secondary computational byproducts or computational measures of this singular universal computational formula. So now I think, and one more postulate that I would mention, there's a few more, maybe I'll mention in the second half of this important presentation some of the theoretical implications of this new God's physics paradigm, and by the way, why it's so important today, including the introduction of a new moral dynamic equilibrium principle into physics, which is part of this new discovery of the universal computational slash consciousness principle reality, which is very relevant, as we can all see in today's events for the world. But in any event, one more theoretical postulate, which is important for our understanding of the initial two initial empirical validations of this new God's physics or computational unified field theory paradigm, that additional theoretical postulates, is what I call the non-continuous accelerated expansion of the universe, which is associated with another key postulate. These are actually, in any event, I'll describe them as one postulate, and that is the non-continuous accelerated expansion of the universe, which is associated with the collective human consciousness focus hypothesis. Essentially, the new God's physics paradigm is postulating that whenever we have a collective human consciousness focus, meaning many human beings are focusing, a large group of human beings are focusing collectively on this singular higher order universal computational slash consciousness principle, that brings about a non-continuous increase in the universe's accelerated rate of expansion. And I give the example of the Jewish Rosh Hashanah New Year 2 days time interval, in which millions of Jews all around the world are focusing collectively on this universal computational slash consciousness principle. In religious terms, we would call it God. But in any event, when millions of individuals, in this case Jews, are focusing on this universal consciousness principle, universal computational consciousness principle, that is postulated or predicted to bring about a non-continuous increase in the rate of the universe's expansion. So that would bring about a non-continuous accelerated rate of expansion of the universe. I called, by the way, cosmologists and astronomers during the last Rosh Hashanah 2 days time interval, that was on September 27th and 28th of 2021. I called cosmologists and astronomers all over the world to verify and validate that in fact, or if in fact, there has been a non-continuous increase in the universe's expansion rate, accelerated expansion rate. I've not received yet results from that critical prediction, but more generally, there is a prediction that over a period of time, the universe's expansion rate would increase, would not remain constant, but would increase with time, due to this collective human consciousness focus hypothesis. I think now we're ready to describe the two initial validations, empirical validations, of this new God's physics or computational unified field theory critical predictions, unique critical predictions. So the first one of them, the first of those is what I call the proton radius puzzle findings. As we all know, now for the past decade, over a decade, that proton radius puzzle has not been explained. In other words, when we take a hydrogen atom, a standard hydrogen atom, which comprises an electron encircling the nucleus with the proton and neutron, we compare that to a muon altered hydrogen atom, in which the electron has been replaced, the negatively charged electron has been replaced with a muon, which is also negatively charged but more massive. And when we compare the radius of the proton in those two atoms, hydrogen atoms, we find that the radius of the muon hydrogen atom, the radius of the proton in the muon hydrogen atom, shrinks. It's significantly smaller, that radius, than the radius of the proton in the standard hydrogen atom. That finding, which could not be explained by quantum mechanics, despite various attempts to do so, and that phenomenon has been validated several times, that puzzle, or that inability of the old material causal quantum model to explain that proton radius puzzle, the shrinkage of the proton in the altered muon atom relative to the standard hydrogen atom is actually comprises an initial empirical validation of God's physics, or the computational unified field theory, critical prediction. Because remember, when we spoke about the fact that according to the new God's physics paradigm, the UCP computes simultaneously for every spatial pixel in the universe, it computes its four basic physical features of space, energy, mass, and time. Specifically for mass, as we said, and as I've written, it's been published in over 70 to 80 peer-reviewed articles. The mass computational definition by the UCP of any particle is, as we said, object consistent computation of the UCP gives us the mass value. In other words, it's computing, the UCP is computing to what degree a particle constitution or composition is identical across a series of frames. The more instances in which a particle would appear identical across a series of frames, that would give us a greater mass value. And that implies that the spatial consistency of a particle would increase with mass. In other words, the muon particle, which is more massive, would have a greater object consistency. We would say also, in a sense, spatial consistency. It would be computed as smaller and appearing across a greater number of frames than the electron particle. Because the UCP computes the mass of a given particle according to its object consistent computational measures. So the more massive muon particle would be presented and computed as more spatially consistent across a series of frames than the electron particle. Since the muon particle affects the proton, then the proton itself would become more spatially consistent, i.e. smaller and more accurate in the measurements, which is exactly what the proton radius puzzle findings indicate. And so we find that as opposed to the quantum mechanics inability to explain the proton radius puzzle, that's why it's called the proton radius puzzle, because there's no satisfactory explanation for that shrinkage of the radius of the proton in the muon altered hydrogen atom relative to the standard hydrogen atom. So as opposed to the inability of quantum mechanics to explain this proton radius puzzle phenomenon, the God's physics computational unified field theory critical prediction in fact precisely predicts these findings, that the more massive muon particle would have a greater spatial consistency or object consistency relative to the electron particle, which means that the muon affected by the proton affected by this heavier or more massive muon particle would also exhibit a smaller radius, exactly confirmed and validated by the proton radius puzzle. That's an initial first empirical validation of God's physics computational unified field theory critical prediction, which cannot be explained by the old material causal quantum mechanics model. The second initial validation of God's physics unique critical prediction has to do with what I mentioned earlier about the non-continuous accelerated expansion of the universe. Again, even though I've not received I've not received empirical validations of the specific critical prediction regarding the collective human consciousness focus, such as in the Jewish Rosh Hashanah, but when we look more generally, there is a phenomenon, or actually a puzzle, which cannot be explained again by relativity theory, general relativity theory of the old material causal paradigm, but actually validates the God's physics non-continuous accelerated rate of expansion postulate. And that is, there's an emerging phenomenon which we all know about the gap, the cosmological astronomical gap in the universe's accelerated expansion, when we measure, or when cosmologists measure the background radiation indices of the universe's accelerated rate of expansion, they found a smaller, significantly smaller rate of accelerated expansion of the universe as compared to the current astronomical measures of the universe's accelerated expansion. That gap, that cosmological astronomical gap between the early stage universe measurements of the rate of expansion of the universe and the current contemporary measurements, astronomical measurements of the universe's current rate accelerated expansion, there is an increase between the early stage and the contemporary measurements of the universe's accelerated expansion, which cannot be explained by general relativity theory. But those are this gap completely and directly validates the prediction of God's physics, computational unified field theory, critical prediction of a non-continuous accelerated increase or expansion in the universe's rate of expansion. So we have a second instance, initial empirical validation of God's physics critical prediction about the non-continuous accelerated rate of expansion of the universe. So we now are getting, and again, this was published in various articles that of God's physics paradigm, but we stand now at a point, a historic point, which is equivalent to Eddington's verification of Einstein's solar eclipse, 1919 solar eclipse validation of Einstein's critical prediction regarding the double valued curvature of Mercury's perihelion around the Sun. Because we have now two initial empirical validations of God's physics critical predictions. One was about the proton radius puzzle. The other one is about the non-continuous accelerated rate of expansion. Both of those predictions of God's physics paradigm have been validated, and they are more valid or accurate and actually cannot be explained by the old mature causal paradigm of both relativity theory and quantum mechanics. And this is why we stand at a historic point now, in which we are now evidencing the acceptance of this new God's physics paradigm, the necessary acceptance of this new God's physics paradigm as the new satisfactory scientific paradigm for the for theoretical physics. It was shown to be able to resolve the theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, and essentially by embedding both relativity theory and quantum mechanics as components within that universal computational formula, and also for theoretical considerations about the much broader gaze or theoretical framework of the new God's physics paradigm that embeds within it single spatial temporal, you may say relativistic computation, multi-spatial temporal quantum wave measurements or computations, and those are both embedded within the exhaustive theoretical framework of looking at the universal frames comprising the entire physical universe for every minimal time point. So the new God's physics paradigm was able to, a causal computation paradigm, was able to show that it's been able to resolve the theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics by embedding them within this universal computational formula, etc. B, offering an alternative explanation for the accelerated rate of expansion of the universe, and I'll mention here succinctly, according to the new God's physics paradigm, the alternative explanation for the universe's accelerated expansion is not dark matter, dark energy, which are discarded as superfluous, as non-existent. The accelerated rate of the universe expansion is the result of the UCP adding an accelerated number of exhaustive spatial pixels to each universal frame, each consecutive universal frame. And more dramatically, there is a non-continuous increase in the accelerated the universe's expansion, ensuing from the fact that that same UCP, whenever there is a collective human consciousness, it brings about, the UCP is then increasing the universe's accelerated expansion in a significant manner. And again, this has been verified more generally by the non-continuous accelerated expansion indicated by the cosmological astronomical gap in the universe's accelerated expansion. So we said, A, the new God's physics paradigm was able to resolve the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics. B, the new God's physics paradigm was able to offer an alternative satisfactory explanation for the accelerated of the universe expansion, which discards dark matter, dark energy, and actually has been validated now in initial empirical validation through the cosmological astronomical gap, indicating a non-continuous accelerated expansion of the universe, which has to do with the UCP's addition of spatial pixels, most dramatically seen in the collective human consciousness focus. That specific prediction still has to be validated, and I'm still calling cosmologists and astronomers to test that. But we saw a resolution of the apparent theoretical inconsistency between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, an alternative satisfactory explanation for the accelerated rate of the universe's expansion, which has received an initial empirical validation. And the third point, which is most significant, is these two initial empirical validations of this new God's physics paradigm, both about the proton radius puzzle and the cosmological astronomical gap, indicating a non-continuous accelerated rate of expansion of the universe. Excuse me. So we've reached a point that we understand that this new God's physics or computational unified field theory is regarded and should be regarded and has to be accepted as the new scientific paradigm, a causal computation paradigm for 21st century theoretical physics. And that's a very significant point in the history and development of physics, equivalent to Einstein's revolution of 1919 when it was validated by Eddington as critical prediction. Now I would briefly describe some of the theoretical implications of this new profound God's physics or computational unified field theory paradigm. Also hint at the relevance of this new paradigm for the world at large. And again, call leading universities and experimental physicists to communicate and collaborate with me directly in order to further validate and substantiate and investigate this exciting new scientific paradigm of the 21st century, the God's physics, computational unified field theory, new paradigm. Some of the theoretical implications of this new God's physics paradigm, I would mention two key postulates, and then again talk about the relevance of this new exciting paradigm for humanity, for our world today. So two additional theoretical postulates are one I call, it was termed the computational invariance principle, and closely related to that is the universal consciousness reality. The computational invariance principle essentially tells us that if indeed the universal computational principle, the UCP, or universal consciousness principle, exists continuously and uniformly and constantly, both during its computation of the universal frames. Each consecutive universal frame is computed, remember, simultaneously. All of its constituting exhaustive spatial pixels are computed simultaneously by the UCP. So the UCP exists both during its computation and creation of each consecutive universal frame, and the UCP also exists in between any two consecutive universal frames, wherein the whole universe dissolves back into the UCP. So we contrast the computational invariance principle contrast between the continuous uniform constant existence of this UCP both during the frames, during its computation and creation of the frames, and also in between each two consecutive frames. And we contrast that to the phenomenal appearance of the universe and its four basic physical features, which exist only during the frames, as computed by the UCP, but the universe and its four basic physical features dissolves, does not exist, ceases to exist, and dissolves back into the UCP in between frames. So the computational invariance principle is telling us since we contrast the continuous, constant, uniform existence of this singular higher ordered UCP, which exists both during the frames and in between the frames, to the only transient phenomenal existence of the universe, including its four basic physical features. The physical universe exists only during the frames as computed by the UCP, but does not exist in between the frames. It dissolves back into the UCP. And therefore, the God's physics new computational invariance principle is telling us that we only have one singular reality, that is the universal computational principle, which is also then called universal conscious reality. But the universal computational principle is the only reality which is, in a sense, real. It's the only thing that exists constantly, continuously, and uniformly, both during the frames and in between the frames. And whereas the physical universe is seen as only a transient phenomenal manifestation of this singular universal computational principle. The second associated theoretical postulate is called the universal conscious reality. Essentially, it's telling us that since the universe exists only as a transient phenomenal manifestation of this UCP, but doesn't exist continuously, therefore we reach the inevitable conclusion that we only have one universal consciousness reality, principle reality. That universal conscious reality exists both during the frames and appears or manifests as the universe, and it also exists singularly without the physical universe in between the frames. But there's only one reality, which I call the universal consciousness reality. That universal conscious reality is the only reality and that exists behind the universe and transcending the universe, and the physical universe becomes only a transient phenomenal manifestation as part of this universal conscious reality. That obviously alters our basic understanding and appreciation of the universe, because the universe ceases to exist as a material, causal, continuous entity. The physical universe is only manifestation, transient phenomenal manifestation of this universal consciousness reality. One of the 70 to 80 plus peer-reviewed scientific articles that were published about God's physics paradigm was called A New Atom and Purposeful Universe. The new atom, quote unquote, is this universal consciousness reality or universal computational principle, because that's the only thing that exists and is building up, is comprising the universe, and exists uniformly both during the frames and in between the frames. Now I'll talk about, we're getting now to the last part of this important video presentation, in which I'm also, in a sense, showing the general public and scientists and the general public why this new God's physics paradigm is so important for science and for humanity. Because one of the additional postulates, theoretical postulates of this of this new God's physics paradigm is, I call it the reversed time Geulah goal postulate or hypothesis. And I'm giving a metaphor that in the same way that if we had a king, such as King Solomon, building a temple, when he built the temple, he had to have a blueprint of the completed temple before he called the various construction workers to start constructing this immaculate temple. We can't imagine or fathom a situation that the builders would start creating a temple without a blueprint, because they would not know what to do, and it would not result in this immaculate temple. So there has to be a blueprint in this metaphor of the complete immaculate temple before the beginning of the whole construction and the progression of the construction of the temple. And that metaphor is just, in a sense, explaining in a certain way the reverse time Geulah goal postulate or hypothesis postulate. And that essentially says that this universal consciousness reality has been has planned beforehand before the creation of the universe and along the whole progression of the universe and evolution of the universe. It's been pre-planned by this universal conscious reality, or UCP, towards the end result. The end result, the goal of the whole progression and evolution of the universe, is to reach what I call the Geulah goal state. The Geulah goal, Geulah is a term taken from Jewish Hasidic tradition, denoting excuse me, a perfected state of the universe. That perfected Geulah state of the universe is a state in which humanity and science recognizes the singularity of this universal consciousness reality, and that universal consciousness reality also possesses, or UCP possesses, also certain characteristics which are postulated by this new God's physics paradigm. It has certain characteristics such as morality, the moral principle, which I'll talk about, oneness, peace, harmony, all goodness. That's all characteristics of this universal consciousness reality, postulated by God's physics new paradigm. And the thing is that the reverse time Geulah goal postulate or hypothesis essentially says that the whole planning and execution of the universe's evolution has been pre-planned to reach that perfected Geulah state, in which the universal conscious reality would manifest and would be, in a sense, recognized by humanity and by science. So the Geulah perfected state is a state, Geulah goal state, perfected state, is a state of perfection, morally, spiritually, even physically, in which humanity and science recognize the singular existence and reality of this universal conscious reality, which is also characterized by morality, all goodness, peace, harmony, etc., and the whole progression of the evolution of the universe towards that perfected Geulah state. And again, the metaphor would be that the same way that King Solomon had to have the blueprint of the completed Immaculate Temple before and during the whole progression of the build-up of the temple, same manner, the UCP, or Universal Conscious Reality, has pre-planned the whole progression of the universe towards that perfected Geulah state, and implied is that it's been pre-planned the evolution of the universe from inanimate matter through animate plants, animals, human beings, possessing the most expansive form of consciousness and possessing only or solely possessing the free moral choice as part of this expanded form of consciousness, and then humanity reaching that perfected Geulah state, which is a perfected spiritual, moral, and even physical state. And so, in a sense, this new God's physics, computational unified field theory paradigm is telling us that the world does not operate by mere material causal interactions. It's not, as the old paradigm has been telling us, as if the universe has been created by a random Big Bang nuclear event. It's drifting into nothingness, and everything is happening by mere chance, by material causal interactions. The new paradigm is telling us, first of all, the physical universe is not a material causal entity. It doesn't exist as a material entity. It doesn't evolve by cause and effect, material interactions. The physical universe, in fact, is really only a transient phenomenal manifestation of this singular higher ordered universal consciousness reality, which has pre-planned the whole evolution of the universe from the end result, from the end Geulah goal state, perfected state, backwards towards the beginning of the universe. In other words, the blueprint of the Geulah perfected state has been at the initial, before the creation of the universe, and has been guiding the whole universe to evolve from inanimate matter, animate animals, plants, animals, human beings, and humanity reaching that Geulah perfected state. This is an extremely profound change in our basic conception of the physical universe and of science, etc. Now, why is this so important for us, even for humanity more generally? And it has very relevant implications for today's world and today's events. We all see the crisis in Ukraine and are startled by the loss of human lives and damage and injury. But the thing is, science now stands at a historic point. Science now recognizes, with the validation of this new God's physics paradigm, new computational unified field theory paradigm, which is able to resolve the theoretical inconsistencies between relativity theory and quantum mechanics, is able to offer an alternative explanation and a satisfactory explanation for the external rate of the universe's expansion. But this new paradigm is shifting our basic understanding of the universe. The universe does not operate by mere chance, material causal interactions. The universe is being guided. First of all, the real reality behind the universe, the new atom and purposeful universe, as I called one of the articles, the real reality, the new atom, or the real reality behind the universe, is not atoms or subatomic particles. Those are only a manifestation of the real reality, the singular reality of the universal conscious reality. And as we said, with these two postulates of the computational invariance principle and universal conscious reality, there exists only one singular reality. That one singular reality is the universal consciousness reality, which is manifesting and producing the universe at an extremely rapid rate of many trillions of times per second. It's creating, computing the universe, dissolving it back into itself, and creating a larger universe and evolving the universe continuously towards the perfected Geulah state. I mentioned before, then we will see the relevance of this new God's physics paradigm for humanity, and even specifically for the tragedy happening now in Ukraine. And that is that we understand that there is a moral principle guiding the universal consciousness reality, is guiding the universe towards the evolution, or guiding the universe through an evolution towards the perfected Geulah state. And one of the key mechanisms, key guiding principles of the universe's evolution by the UCP is the moral principle. I call it the dynamic equilibrium moral principle. That's one of the characteristics of this universal conscious reality. As I mentioned earlier, this new dynamic equilibrium moral principle essentially is telling us that the UCP possesses a series of what I call multi-spatial temporal reservoir bank, or reservoir of all the past, present, and multiple possible futures frames for each individual human being on the planet. In other words, the UCP possesses or embeds within it this bank, this reservoir, multi-spatial temporal reservoir of all past, present, and multiple possible universal frames for the whole progression of the universe. And the moral principle is telling us that since the UCP has this characteristic of unity, harmony, peace, and morality, the dynamic equilibrium moral principle is telling us that every second that a human being makes a moral or an immoral, God forbid, choice, that moral or immoral choice instigates or results in the UCP choosing for that human being an equivalent future. In order to correct, it's a mechanism for correcting and opening our eyes of individual human beings and of humanity generally, of the oneness of creation. I give a metaphor that if we had a trampoline, within that trampoline there would be a metal bar connecting 2 points on the trampoline. That metal bar, if one point would push the other point, the elasticity of the trampoline sheath would cause the opposite reaction. In other words, if one individual human being which represents one point within that uniform trampoline sheath, if one human being would decide to inflict pain or suffering on another human being, according to the UCP, according to the universal conscious reality dynamic equilibrium moral principle, the dynamic equilibrium moral principle would balance or correct that moral imbalance in which one human being inflicts pain or suffering on another human being. Then that first human being, which made an immoral choice, would have to experience the same pain or suffering that he's inflicted on another human being. And by the way, this is not seen as a punishment. This is seen as a correction of the immoral imbalance and of, in a sense, our lack of understanding that really all human beings are part of this universal conscious reality, which is characterized by morality and unity and peace and harmony. And so what we're starting to understand with this new God's physics, computational unified field theory paradigm, is that the universe is actually operating based on the universal conscious reality dynamic equilibrium moral principle, is operating in a moral sense, in a moral manner. And in fact, our choices of moral actions, or God forbid, immoral actions, they would have consequences for us individually in one of the futures that we would have to experience. By the way, in brackets, still, since this universal conscious reality is characterized by all goodness, there's another element there which I called teshuva, or the power of teshuva, that when human being realizes that they've made an immoral choice, they've inflicted perhaps suffering on another human being, and they have a conscious remorse about what they've done. They make a conscious resolution to try their utmost best not to repeat that, and perhaps to correct, for sure, to correct that immoral action, asking forgiveness, trying to compensate for that immoral action. That teshuva, again a term taken from Jewish Hasidic terminology, but that teshuva, that remorse and change in the human being consciousness, asking forgiveness, having remorse about the immoral action, making a conscious choice not to repeat that, that can actually omit the universal conscious reality selection of a negative, quote-unquote, future that would result from an immoral action that any individual human being is making. And that, in a sense, teaches us, the whole purpose of that dynamic equilibrium moral principle is to teach humanity collectively and individually that we're not separate from each other, and that we cannot harm each other, and that in fact we have to act in a kind and in a good moral action, moral manner towards each other, realizing that we're all part of this singular universal consciousness reality. And so what we're seeing is, with this new understanding, is that first of all, the universal conscious reality is guiding and is gravitating the whole universe towards that perfected Geulah state. In the perfected Geulah state, which in a sense, science now, through this new God's physics, computational unified field theory, new paradigm, validated new paradigm, we're starting to enter that Geulah perfected state. Because when science and humanity more generally realizes that there's only one universal conscious reality, that one universal conscious reality is all goodness, is characterized by all goodness, morality, and steering the universe towards that perfected Geulah state. So we are now entering that the beginning of this Geulah goal perfected state, and has tremendous implications for science and for humanity. I give the metaphor and I say that the same way that a human being would not, a sane, mentally balanced human being would not take their right hand and inflict pain on their left hand, God forbid. Why? Because we realize, a human being realizes that it's part of the same, it's part of us, it's part of the same entity. So he or she would not take the right hand and inflict pain on the left hand. In a sense, what this morality principle, dynamic equilibrium morality principle, and the discovery and validation, empirical validation of God's physics new paradigm, what it's doing for humanity is teaching us, in a sense, that we are like the right hand and left hand. Every human being on the planet is like the right hand and left hand of this universal conscious reality. And we would start realizing that the same way that we would not take our right hand and inflict pain on the left hand, same manner, we cannot and we should not, and we would not even fathom a situation that we would inflict pain on another human being. Because we know we would have to, God forbid, experience the same negative situation unless we make teshuvah, but we should not make that immoral action. And B, because we realize that there's only one reality, and that one reality is the universal conscious reality, and is all goodness, is moral, is characterized by peace and harmony. And so the dissemination and realization of this new God's physics paradigm will bring about a state, this perfected Geulah state, in which all of humanity would realize that we're all part of the same universal conscious reality, that we should and we must act in a moral and beneficial manner towards each other, and that we should, in a sense, recognize, appreciate, and operate in a manner that is harmonious, that is compatible with this discovery of the singular existence of this universal conscious reality. I'm calling again, this obviously has immediate implications for the tragedy happening in Ukraine. I think that the more science and humanity more generally would realize and would accept this new paradigm, realizing there's only one reality, the universal conscious reality. We're part of that reality. We're inseparable from that reality. That reality is moral, is all goodness, is steering humanity towards that perfected state of Geulah. This is bringing and will bring a state of peace and harmony in the world, and a state of cooperation and moral action between all of humanity, and that's part of this Geulah perfected state. So I think it's extremely important for science and for humanity to investigate, to validate, and to accept and fully appreciate this new paradigmatic shift of 21st century theoretical physics. I'm calling again all leading universities in the world, physics leading universities in the world, experimental physicists, cosmologists, astronomers, subatomic accelerator physicists, to collaborate with me. Again, my personal email is Dr. Bentwich, DRBENTWICH at gmail.com, all lowercase letters. And I'm calling all leading universities and experimental physicists to communicate with me and collaborate with me regarding this, the validation and further investigation of this new God's physics computational unified field theory paradigm for 21st century. Thank you very much.